There we go. We are live. Hafiday Tomas, last week's co-presenter. Buenas, Tomas. Always good to see you, Talu. And now that we are recorded, now that we are live on Facebook, I want to say Hafiday to everybody and welcome back to the second episode of the Minagåhet Ellet webinar series. My name's Andrew Roberto, and I'm a program coordinator here at the Northern Marianas Humanities Council. This is the second of 4 scheduled webinars that are based on a survey titled Media Use and Perceptions, Civic Behaviors and Attitudes on Local Issues in the CNMI. Today's episode will focus on motivation for news consumption, news media skepticism, news media literacy, and more. Again, we are joined by Dr. Francis Dalisay, the head researcher from the University of Guam who conducted the survey. He will present his data shortly. Joining him to give a related presentation on media literacy is Catherine Perry, host of the Your Humanities half-hour radio program. The full recorded webinar episode will be found on the Humanities YouTube page. Okay, for those of joining us, I've already mentioned that this is being recorded. Your microphones will be muted through the entire duration of the presentation. There's a question and answer portion of the webinar at the end, and I will be reading those questions aloud. Please send them my way in the chat feature. For those using Facebook Live to watch the webinar, please send questions to the Humanities Council Facebook page. Before the start of the presentation, I'd like to give a short biography of our presenters. Catherine Perry aims to facilitate understanding and synergy between people through communication and has nearly 30 years experience in the field in the Marianas. A former radio operator, television anchor, and government public information officer, Perry is the owner of a boutique public relations firm in Saipan. She is the host and director of 2 media productions of the Northern Marianas Humanities Council, the weekly radio show Your Humanities Half Hour, and the monthly Facebook Live show Marianas Stories. Dr. Francis Dalisay, we met last week, but I'm going to go ahead and give his biography, of course. Dr. Francis Dalisay, he is an associate professor of communication at UOG. He teaches courses in journalism and digital communication technologies and is the publisher for Triton's Call, UOG campus's newspaper. Dalisay received MA and PhD degrees from the Edward R. Murrow College of Communication at Washington State University. He earned a BA in communication with the print journalism track from UOG, where he graduated as class valedictorian. Outside of academia, Dalisay has worked as a writer, reporter, editor, and marketing and strategic communication assistant. Hafiday. Maybe our panelists can say hello.
Hello, Hafiday.
Hafiday, Tero. Good morning, everyone.
All right, now with biographies out of the way, I'm going to hand the screen and the floor over to Francis. All right, Francis, break a leg.
All right, thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Catherine, for being here today, and also thanks for all the attendees. I think only Amir and Tomas were here last week, so thank you for visiting us again today.
Actually, Josh was as well.
Oh, sorry, Josh was here too. Sorry about that. Okay, so let me go ahead and pull up my screen here. Says this will stop other screen sharing. Okay.
That's fine.
All right. So the first few slides is basically what I presented last week, but I'll probably just rush through it since a few of you were already here last week. But then I'll just go to the newer findings for this week. All right. So these are the points I'll be covering. I'll just provide a brief background and purpose of the study, some of the variables we use, the method, results, and a few slides, discussing the results of these of what I'm reporting today. And again, these first few slides I already went through last week, so I'll just sort of like rush through this. So again, this is the purpose of this. It was a survey. sponsored by the Northern Marianas Humanities Council, and it was conducted to get a sense of where the CNMI stands in terms of several key indicators of engagement in local news media literacy, and civic engagement. And again, it was sponsored or funded by a grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. And keep in mind that this survey was administered during the run-up to the 2020 election. And as far as we know, this is one of the first studies of its kind conducted in the CNMI that gauges, comprehensively gauges quantitatively news media engagement and civic vibrancy. So for today's webinar, these are going to be the main points we're going to be talking about: the results for news media literacy, news media skepticism, perceptions of online privacy, and susceptibility to misinformation, and support for preventing the spread of misinformation. And these were topics for last week's webinar, and next two that are coming up, these are going to be the topics that we're going to be covering here. All right, so in terms of method, again, like I discussed last week, this was a self-administered online survey, and we adapted questions that have been used already in this part of the world, the Marianas. A lot of this was coming from the research we've been doing in Guam for a number of years now. And as I said last week, we had an advisory board come together. Catherine was part of that board, and so was Tomas. And they provided advice in how to best administer the survey, and some input about making sure that the questions were appropriate to the Marianas and the CNMI. So we collected data through what is called respondent-driven quota, snowball, and convenience sampling. And just skipping over these next bullet points. The last bullet point here is it's important that as I go through the results today, that as with other surveys conducted in the CNMI, these results should be understood only to represent the responses of those who completed the survey, okay? And so that's what you should know, and as we're going through the results here. Okay, just to quickly run through these data again. So 481 completed the survey, although I think roughly 700 started completing it, but they didn't finish. And so we only chose surveys to analyze surveys that were a majority were completed, like 60% of them of the survey was completed. And so this is 73% completion rate, 481 completed survey. And most of the respondents were from Saipan, and females outnumbered males. So what that means is we undersampled males, and age range was between 18 and 81, and ethnic groups breakdown were Chamorro, Filipino, Caribbean, and Caucasian. Okay, these are the most represented groups in the sample. And length of residence was between 1 to 72 years. Average length was about 23 years. The age range was 18 to 81, and 35 was the median. And household income, the median was 20,000 to 39,999. Okay. Again, that gives you sort of an idea of who completed the survey. And as like I said, we sort of like undersampled males, and so as you interpret the results, again, like I said, this is only the results I'm going over is can only be representative of this particular type of respondents. Okay, so results. So compared to last week, I actually have less results to go over today. So this won't be too long as last week's presentation. So the first topic here is about news media literacy. So our survey took items from the news media literacy scale. So this is an established measure of news media literacy. And I don't know if you guys could read this, but I could read this out loud if you can't. So the items presented the following 4 dimensions of the news media literacy scale. So this scale measures a dimension of authors and audiences. For example, individuals find news sources that reflect their own political values. The next dimension is messages and meanings. For example, news is designed to attract an audience's attention. The third dimension here is representations and realities. Example of an item on that is a news story about conflict is more likely to be featured prominently. And the last dimension is self-perceived media literacy. It's like more of like a subjective, how you perceive yourself to be literate. I have a good understanding of the concept of media literacy is one item for that. And the responses were measured along a 5-point scale, where 1 equals strongly disagree, 5 strongly agree, where a higher score was indicative of higher levels of news media literacy. And note that this is just about news media literacy. You know, when we're talking about media literacy, there's other aspects of media literacy, which Catherine will cover likely in her presentation. And so, you know, we don't cover things like film literacy and so forth, right? So this is strictly just about news media literacy, okay? All right, so these are the results. So these were the specific items. So for example, news companies choose stories based on what will attract the biggest audience. If you recall, this was a scale of 1 to 5, 1 strongly disagree, 5 strongly agree, where a higher score is indicative of higher levels of news media literacy. And so M stands for mean, which I talked about last week, is basically the average score. And SD stands for standard deviation, which is a measure of variation among the mean. So if we're putting here like 0.99, that could mean like, you know, plus or minus 0.99 variation from 3.94, okay? That's one way to interpret that. So that's the mean score. Individuals find news sources that reflect their own political values. The mean score of that is 3.72. 2 people might see the same news story and get different information from it. Mean score is 4.11. Again, that's close to 5. People are influenced by news more than they realize. 4.19. That's also close to 5. News is designed to attract an audience's attention. 3.96. News makes things more dramatic than they really are. 3.72. A news story about conflict is more likely to be featured prominently. That's 4. Okay. Now these are the self-perceived news media literacy items. Again, this is more like subjective measures of a respondent's view about how media literate they are. So I have a good understanding of the concept of media literacy. That's 4. I have the skills to interpret news messages. That's 4.05. I am confident in my ability to judge the quality of news. 4.08. Okay. So what does this all mean? Well, I just have some bullet points here in terms of briefly discussing what this means. So on balance, the results suggest respondents have satisfactory levels of news media literacy. So again, recall some of those items were 4 and above, right? Which is, you know, indicative of sort of a high score of media literacy. And perceive themselves as news media literate. As the results show, the mean scores for responses to all the items measuring news media literacy were above the midpoint of 3. So 3 is a midpoint. And so one way is to interpret this, right, on the scale of 1 to 5, where 5 is indicative of good media literacy. And we could say, okay, anything above the midpoint would be deemed as good, right? That's one way to interpret that. And so what we found is, yeah, all the items are above that midpoint of 3. So I guess you could say, okay, that's good. Respondents scored highest on the 2 following items, if you recall, and this represented the dimension of messages and meanings. People are influenced by news more than they realize. and two people might see the same news story and get different information from it, okay? And lastly, respondents scored lowest on the following two items. Individuals find news sources that reflect their own political values, which represented the authors and audience's dimension, and news makes things more dramatic than they really are, which represented the representations and realities dimension, okay? All right, moving on. So that we covered news media literacy. Let's now talk about news media skepticism, which is sort of related to the topic of disinformation and misinformation, which we'll talk about in a moment. And so we adapted a measure of news media skepticism from these scholars here. And news media skepticism was measured with 3 items. For example, one item is, I think news media are fair. And respondents were assessed along a 5-point scale: strongly disagree, 5 strongly agree. And so these were the results for that. So the items used to measure each of the 2 aforementioned, I only mentioned one item in that previous slide, sorry about that, were combined and averaged to form their respective measures. Oh, by the way, I should have said, as I said last week, we're going to come up with a report, or there's going to be an executive summary and report for all these results, and I think later on Andrew is going to explain that they're going to publish that and make it available to the public shortly sometime. So I may not be mentioning all the items on today's presentation, but you can find the results for all those items in that report that they'll be presenting later on. So respondents scored slightly above the midpoint for motivations for news consumption. That was actually the topic for last week. But however, respondents scored lower than the midpoint for the news media skepticism. Okay, so here, this is news media skepticism. So scale of 1 to 5. Remember I said earlier, anything below the midpoint of 3 is indicative of, maybe a sort of like a low score, because 3 is the midpoint, so 2.79. What this means is that the respondents were probably not as skeptical about news media, okay? And so that's how one way we could interpret that. So like last week, I talked about respondents are only slightly motivated to consume news, if you recall. However, for today, but they are not that skeptical about the news they are consuming, okay? So although they find themselves to be media literate, as we saw previously, they're not as skeptical about news, okay? By the way, in the next webinar, I will be talking about something else called political skepticism, which is about political news, okay, and political information. So that's a different form of skepticism. Okay, so moving on, perceptions of online privacy. So we adapted items used by Park. This is another validated scale to measure perceptions of online privacy. So arguably, this is another form of literacy. This is sort of like digital literacy, if you think about it that way. And so let's see what the results show us here. So majority, about 74% of respondents either agreed, so 45%, or strongly agreed, 29%. So added up together, that's a majority, 74%. That most merchants monitor and record their browsing history in their sites, okay? And the mean score for that is 3.98, where 1 strongly disagree, 5 strongly agree. So yeah, they do seem to think and perceive that merchants do monitor and record their browsing history. A majority of respondents also either agree or strongly agree that companies today have the ability to place online advertisements that target users based on information collected from web browsing behaviors. And that is a high mean score, 4.27, close to 5, which is the highest. And more than 90% of the respondents either agreed or strongly agreed that the internet could cause privacy risk. And the mean score was 4.4, close to 5. So what this all means is that the respondents seem to be well aware of some privacy related issues online. Okay, so that's a good thing, right? So now this is, I think, the last variables here that we're covering today. Misinformation and support for preventing the spread of misinformation. Where do respondents stand on that? So our survey contained measures that were designed to indirectly gauge susceptibility to misinformation and support for regulating the spread of misinformation. And these items were adapted from these scholars here. Which, by the way, I mentioned the report that we're going to come up with shortly that's going to be published. The report will provide you with references to these published studies where you can then see these items and those studies to see what those studies were about as well. So we asked participants to what extent they disagreed or agreed with 4 items. These were measured along a 5-point scale, where a higher score indicated greater agreement, and along that strongly disagree, for 5 strongly agree. Okay, I think that this last box should be deleted. Sorry about that, it's sort of redundant. Okay, so these were the items. If I'm exposed to false and inaccurate information in news, I'll be affected by it. So the mean score is 3.7, slightly above the midpoint. So if the average person in the CNMI is exposed to false and inaccurate information news, they will be affected by it. So if you think about this, they're more likely to think that other people are going to be affected by misinformation than themselves. Okay, because see, that's a higher score, so they're more likely to think that other people like around them in the CNMI are going to be more affected by this type of information than they are. Okay. Internet companies such as Google and Facebook should take measures to prevent the spread of false or inaccurate information. So that's 4.33. These last 3 items are about supporting regulation for this to prevent the spread of misinformation. I forgot to mention that. The government should create regulations that help to prevent the spread of false or inaccurate information. And so that's 4.16. And it is important that media users be taught how to recognize false or inaccurate information. That's 4.51. So in other words, as I said above, respondents tend to perceive that they themselves would be less susceptible to false or misleading information in the news than others would be. And also, on average, respondents also tended to agree that internet companies and the government should take measures or create regulations that would help prevent the spread of false or inaccurate information. Again, this is reiterating what I just mentioned above. So, so the respondents are very supportive of the fact that they think that the government should step in and sort of regulate, and people should be taught how to identify misinformation. Okay, so last week we sort of talked about how variables are related to what here. And so what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to, as I close out this presentation, just walk you through some variables that were statistically significant as far as their correlations. So these are 0-order correlations. And what we're looking at here is that, again, these are only the ones that were statistically significant. And what we did here is we combined the items to form single measures. So like earlier, I gave you, for example, like 4 items to measure a given variable. So for that given variable, we combined those items to form that specific variable, okay? Again, this is all laid out in the report if you're interested in reading that when it's published. So here are some key findings of these correlational analyses. Use of news media. I didn't talk about that today. I actually talked about that last week, if you guys recall, for those of you who were here last week. So use of news media was positively associated with news media skepticism, okay? By the way, with correlational analyses, we don't know what's predicting what. We just know that they're related. So it could be that either they're using media and that's making them more skeptical, or it could be that they're more skeptical about it and they're using news media more. Trust in sources for local news, which is another thing we talked about last week, that was positively associated with news media skepticism. Okay, so it could be the more you're trusting local news, the more you're skeptical about it, or it could be that the more you're skeptical about it, you're trusting it more. Okay. All right, so this here is, I didn't put the correlational like results here, like R and so forth here. So I'm just on this, you're probably wondering like what's R, like on this slide here. Like, so R is like, I forgot to mention, was the Pearson correlation. R is the magnitude of the relationship, and 1 is a perfect relationship, and then P is statistical significance. But I was trying to say that I didn't report R on these results here. So self-perceived news media literacy was positively related with education, income, actual news media literacy, and motivations for news consumption, but negatively associated with trustworthiness of social media platforms for local news and news media skepticism. And actual news media literacy was positively related with education, income, and self-perceived news media literacy and motivations for news consumption. You're probably wondering, what is actual and self-perceived? Well, if you recall, earlier I said there's like items that are like more subjective, self-perceived. Those are self-perceived news media literacy. Or the other items were what we consider actual news media literacy. Okay. All right, and so those are the correlations I'm going over right now. Just to sum it up here, just to close out my presentation. So what does this all mean? It could mean a variety of things, but just to sum it up here, respondents have an acceptable level of news media literacy, and they tend to perceive themselves as news media literate. Respondents perceive themselves to be less susceptible to misinformation than they perceive others to be. In other words, they perceive others to be more susceptible to misinformation. This is, in theory, this is what we call the third person effect. And the third person effect could be a bad thing because, if you think that you're less susceptible than others are, what studies have found is that you could be more prone to certain media effects. And I think, if I recall correctly, there is that study I cited earlier where I got these items from. I believe that is one finding they found is that the third person effect, if you think that other people are more susceptible than you are, you're in a sense more confident in yourself, and then you might be more susceptible to misinformation. Respondents also tended to agree that internet companies and the government should take measures or create regulations that would help prevent the spread of false or inaccurate news information, and that consumers should be taught to recognize misinformation. All right, and these were the limitations I also discussed last week. There are various limitations. One of them is sampling error, response error. For example, I said earlier we didn't have enough males take the survey. And it appeared that we might have undersampled certain groups like Filipinos. The trade-offs of this, as I said last week, is that we're able to really get a comprehensive survey here, right at a minimal cost. Because, if we were to do like random sampling, which we didn't do, that probably would have, been more expensive, because we either had to go the mail survey route, telephone survey route, and pay, a market research firm to do that. It's going to be very costly. But we got some. It's a trade-off. We got some useful data here. Also, cross-sectional survey, meaning survey data, cannot be used to test causality, but this study provides a foundation for subsequent empirical research. And lastly, we're going to be talking about other measures in the subsequent webinar, so stay tuned. And like, for example, political engagement, both offline and online, those are related to some of the variables we talked about today. And stay tuned. If you want to attend next week and the subsequent week's lecture or webinars, you're welcome to do that, and we'll run you through some of the results for that. Thank you. And if you want to email me, this is my email address. Take care, and yeah.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Francis. We already have a few questions coming in. I've notified some of the people who have sent questions this way that I will ask questions of you at the question and answer portion of this webinar. I'm particularly fascinated by some of your data regarding skepticism in the community, right? But I will definitely save that for after Catherine's presentation here. What I'm going to do right now is I'm going to share my screen, because that is the screen that has Catherine's presentation. I already gave a little bit of an intro to Catherine, and from here on out, I'm going to share this screen. And Catherine, the floor is yours. Just let me know when to hit next on the slide. Sorry, Catherine, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Thank you. That would be helpful, I'm sure.
Yes, that would.
I just want to ask before we get started, well, I want to thank Francis for sharing that valuable information, for heading up our survey, but I wanted to ask if you could give us a thumbs up if you're a member of the media, or let us know what other profession or position you're representing, because I was thinking that most of the presentation today would be for like the general public, but it looks like a lot of us here today are media, and so if so, I don't want to preach to the choir. So let me know who you are, so that I can try to speak intelligently here.
I'm sending my answers in the chat. You know, I think some people to do that if they're comfortable.
Thank you. I titled my thoughts on what Francis shared very simply, News Media Plus, how it works, how believable it is, how much do we care, and why does it matter? And these are my thoughts. I would say that I'm speaking from my experience working as a former member of the local media, both in radio and television, and then also as a government public information officer, and now a public relations professional. So I'm going to go through some of the results that Francis shared and spend a little bit more time on some, and then share some thoughts that I've gained in researching what these results are, and also ask for your participation, because I'm an interviewer and I much prefer to ask questions than answer questions, but that's my job today. So there'll be times I'll be asking you for your thoughts, and then Andrew can help me monitor those and share those during the Q&A. So moving on, you know, with so much information coming at us today, it really made me think, like, what do people think news is nowadays, with everything that's coming at us, and who gets to decide what is news for you and I, and of course members of the media, you know who that is. And I think most people would agree that the news media is here to inform us, to educate us, and to entertain us. But when it comes to news, it's not Cardi B's latest album, okay? It's intended to inform and educate us about timely and recent happenings. And then the next question is, what is news literacy? I was thinking about that also, because I know we asked participants that, and I was thinking about my own understanding of news literacy and why it's important. And this is something, as some of you may know, that they're actually teaching news literacy in colleges now, because they find that with how much we consume information, there's really a lack of understanding among the younger generation, especially about how to apply news literacy, which is critical thinking skills, in order to judge whether what they're consuming is credible, whether it's true, and to differentiate between whether it's a fact, an opinion, or an assertion. And so news literacy really, it's common to some of us, but it's not common to all of us. And so that's why this survey is important, and why it's important for us to consume, even like we consume a meal, to consume selectively, and to think about what we're consuming. And that's what news literacy allows us to do. So looking at some of the specific questions that Francis gave us results on, and what I've done here is kind of take the larger percentage of whatever the answer was. For example, news companies choose stories based on what will attract the biggest audience. About 3/4 of people said that they agree or disagree with that. And news media, they are targeting you. If you are a consumer, they want to know who their audience is. They want to know what the audience is interested in. And that is largely what the media presents as news. And how do you decide what is newsworthy? It's based on things like proximity, how close it is to where you are, the prominence of the news, who it involves. Is it somebody important? The timeliness, because if it's too old, and I know this working from the PR side of things, if it's too old, it's no longer news. It's history. And that's the challenge sometimes of working with clients, is like, okay, we got to get this out now, because otherwise it's no longer newsworthy. Things also like whether it's scandalous, whether there's conflict. I mean, these are things that determine how news companies choose stories. And one of the things I saw in this survey that I found was really interesting was that many respondents felt it was a function of the media to help contribute to community. And I think that's something that's unique and beautiful about our community here is that sense of connectedness. And it's not just the responsibility of the media to report on things. We also feel that they have a responsibility to help build the community that we want to see. And so that's my thought as far as choosing stories based on what the audience wants. And in regards to finding news sources that reflect our own political values, 66% agreed or strongly agreed with that. And when I saw this question, I was kind of thinking, like, is that related to, could we substitute political values for political parties? Because for a long time here in the Marianas, like, there wasn't a big clear difference between the values of one party over another. It was more, as you know, family oriented. And so this question made me think, like, do people choose their media sources, as far as local media sources, based on whether they feel that that media source supports their party? And of course, the results kind of speak for themselves in terms of this question. But another thing we need to remember is that not only do we have English newspapers here, English media, but we also have at least 2 Korean newspapers that last I knew of, and also 2 Chinese language newspapers. And I know that among these various print publications, there are certain parts of our community that will just not believe what a newspaper says, because they have a perception that that media outlet represents a particular political party. And even though I know that what is being printed is accurate, for example, it was a press release that I was a part of or something like that, there are some people who just won't believe it because of the slant that they think that this media has. So I think it's important to kind of reflect, to not necessarily, you know, we talk a lot today about cancel culture, not necessarily just disregard anything we read or consume in the media that we don't agree with, for several reasons. One, it can, we need all the information we can get, and this is where we need to apply those critical skills so we can make better choices, be open to opposing views, and not create unnecessary barriers in our community. The next question, this was actually, as Francis said, one of the strongest, is that people are influenced by news more than they realize. And I just want to ask those of you out there, I mean, would you agree with that? Do you think that you're influenced by news more than you realize? And as I think Francis kind of alluded to, this thing called confirmation bias, where our brain, it's really a function of our brain. Sometimes it's not even intentional. Our brain tends to look for and pay more attention to things that we already believe. And our brain seeks to validate our own ego. And our brain has limited attention, so we can't pay attention to all the input we're getting. So this is something that our brain does, even subconsciously. So it's something that we should remain aware of. And like when you read that, hear that story, or read that comment that you don't agree with, or receive that criticism, see, I got to talk faster, receive that criticism that rubs you the wrong way, I would say always reflect, because they say that if you get angry about a criticism, it's usually because there's some truth to it. And if we're self-aware, then we can separate what is actually meant to hurt us from what might actually be a truth in that story, or in that comment, or in that criticism of our media, and that only makes us better as a community. And I would say this also is pertinent to us as a small community, because I remember when I worked at Marianas Cablevision as a reporter, when I got there, they had a policy in the newsroom that if you were going to report on a suspect, you had to include their first name, middle name, last name, and age. And the reason being is there had been a news story a few years before where they had only reported a person's first name and last name. And you can imagine how many Juan Camacho, or whatever the guy's name was, I don't know, there are in the Marianas, and suddenly all Juan Camachos were a suspect for this crime, and so it's really important, I think, to be aware of how we are influenced by news, especially in this community, and to let go of our ego in a sense, and reflect on what we can learn from that situation. Regarding the question, two people might see the same news story and get different information from it. I think we pretty much all agree with that. They say there's two sides to every story. In the newsroom, they say there's at least two sides to every story, probably more. I mean, the example I can think of is, you remember that dress that went viral in 2015, where it was everybody was saying, no, the dress is purple, and then everybody was saying, no, the dress is green, or something like that, right? Everybody was looking at the same picture, but half the people thought the dress was one color and everybody else thought it was another color. So if we can't even agree on what color a dress is, you can imagine all the various opinions, perceptions we can have of a news story. And I recall when I was a reporter, we used to interview the governor. I had the Governor Teno on my beat, and so we would all stand around him with our microphones. We'd all share questions, get the same answers, and then head back to our newsroom. And usually, when the stories came out, usually they were the same. They kind of focused on the same thing. Occasionally, a reporter would kind of highlight something different, or take a different angle. And once in a while, somebody would report something that was just not accurate. And I'd be like, no, that's not what he said. That's not what he meant. But it wasn't necessarily intentional. It was just something was lost, and I've made that mistake myself as a reporter. I attended a testimony by the Saipan Garment Manufacturers Association at the House, and I stayed there for like 30 minutes, went home, wrote my story, I went back to the newsroom, wrote the story, it aired, and then as I was reviewing the testimony, the full testimony, I was like, wow, oh my goodness, I just said SGMA had the exact opposite position as what their position actually is. And so in that situation, you either issue a correction. What I did was I called them up right away. I apologized. I offered them time the next day to clarify their position. And so I think, in the media, we know that when we make a mistake, that generally it's not intentional. But for members of the general public, I hope they can understand that as well. In my experience being on both sides of the coin here, mistakes like that, even big mistakes, there's various reasons why it happens, and it's usually not intentional. And I'll talk a little bit about that more later. News is designed to attract an audience's attention. Obviously, everything from the headline to the fonts, the way they share to social media. News makes things more dramatic than they really are. I mean, it does happen, but I would say rarely in the local media, in my experience. And there's another thing that happens. Sometimes we personally make things more dramatic than they actually are. I learned a new word. It's called availability heuristic. The more examples that come to mind, the more likely we think it is. And the example I can give of this is, I don't know if you guys remember, it was before the typhoons, we were having a lot of burglaries, like a lot of burglaries, and they were being reported on a lot, right? And like it bothered me, and I was like, dude, like, what's happening to our community? Everybody's, we used to be such good people, and now we're out there like robbing each other, and and then so I happened to be chatting with my neighbor who is a police officer one day, and I asked him, I was like, what percentage of burglaries would you say are like drug related? I think we were talking about drugs or something, and he said, all of them. And those are his exact words. He said all of them. Okay, that was a little bit of an exaggeration. I don't know, but he said all of them. And that just made me realize that I had this concept that, oh my gosh, our community is going down the tubes, our culture is changing, and blah, 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 which is true to some extent, but really it was people abusing drugs specifically who were doing the burglaries, which changed my perspective a lot, because we all know how powerful that addiction is. So I guess the takeaway there is that the news media is choosing what they offer for us to consume, but we also need to be, like I said, use our critical thinking skills, get more information to figure out what the real story is. Talking about conflict in news media, there's a saying, I'm sure you guys have heard it: if it bleeds, it leads. If it bleeds, it's the top story. And often, and this is also part of our brain's tendency to focus on the negative versus the positive, which you can see a lot more in like the national media. But I would say here in the Pacific, because of our cultural mores like respect and saving face, this is not as prevalent as in the national media. And I think that's a good thing. And I would say that if you are consuming a particular medium and you see that it's all about conflict, and they're not reporting on anything else, I'm not saying don't read it, because like I said, there might be some truth in there, but just be aware that they have an agenda, and it may not be necessarily about building the community up, although there may be some truth in what they're saying. I think news media are accurate. Okay, I don't think I need to have to say much about that. As Francis said, a lot of people think they have a good understanding of the concept of media literacy, which leads us to the next question. And I want to spend some time here. About 80% of people said they have the skills to interpret news messages, and they are confident in their ability to judge the quality of news. So people are feeling pretty good about how they evaluate the news. The question I would like to ask is how do you go about doing that? How do you evaluate? And for me, I would say, I was hoping to get feedback, but it's okay, we'll wait to the end. Very simply, okay, I think a lot of people don't understand the difference between a press release and a news article. So I'm going to give an example. And let me just explain briefly. A press release is generated by a company or a business or an office, and it's their message that they want to get across. A news story is generated by the news organization. So obviously, if you are a business or an organization issuing a press release, you have your own agenda, and you put that in the press release, whatever it may be. You want to sell something, you want to convince something, you want to blame somebody, or whatever it may be. That's your opinion that you put in the press release. Whereas the news has a responsibility to be more fair, and you would expect that the articles they generate would be more would be balanced and fair. So but you would be surprised at the number of people who don't know how to identify a press release, which many times contains the opinion of the person who produced it. So real quickly, I'm just going to use this as an example. And I just picked the first press release that showed up on the paper today. I still get one of my papers print copy because I love to flip through the newspaper. But okay, at the end of this article, you can see that it is written, oh, sorry, here, I'll put this in, PR, okay? So that tells you that this news story was produced by whoever the article is about. And public relations people, we love this because the local media is so generous in printing the press releases of my clients. Thank you very much, guys. And so we love it because we're able to get a very strong partnership and cooperation from the local media in getting our message out to the community. But you also need to be careful as consumers for the non-media out there that you, when you see this little PR here, you need to evaluate that press release from the mindset that somebody has an agenda. That's why they wrote that press release. And another thing you can look for, I mean, that's basic. And oh my goodness, you guys, you know, you have probably experienced this with companies who every time somebody sneezes in the company, they issue a press release. And you know what? They get a lot of coverage and they get their message out there a lot. So just because, you know, there's a lot of news coverage in the media about something doesn't necessarily mean everything that it says. You have to evaluate it. And so I just wanted to share that because I think sometimes people just consume without looking as to who is actually generating that story. And press releases play a very valuable role, but just be cautious with that. Okay, so how am I on time, Andrew?
Don't worry about it. I want to hear your whole presentation.
Okay. All right, I got about 5 slides left. Okay, motivations for news consumption. This one was pretty interesting, I thought, because 3/4 of people said they follow the news because they like to, but actually almost pretty much a quarter of people said they follow the news because they're supposed to. And I was wondering why that was, whether there's some kind of like social pressure to be up on the news. it's like, with things happening so instantaneously now in the 24-hour news cycle, it's like, dude, if you don't know what's going on, you're backwards, you're out of touch. This can actually lead to a lot of stress. So I would advise, if you're one of those people who only follow the news because you're supposed to, maybe you don't need to consume as much news as you do. Maybe you're placing yourself under undue stress, always on the phone or something like that. Just either limit your sources or limit the hours, and maybe you'll start to enjoy your news consumption more. I think the news media is fair. Half of the people were on the fence about this, and I think news media tell the whole story. Half of the people disagreed or strongly disagreed, and 38% neither agreed or disagree. And I think these two are related, and I think the media is going to understand what I'm saying here. But I personally would have answered this a little bit more optimistic, and I think that's because an important thing is knowing the people who are bringing you the news. And this is the advantage of having long-term reporters and editors and publishers, is that the community has an opportunity to get to know them personally. And when you get to know somebody personally, what their values are, what their agenda is, if they have an agenda, what's important to them. And so you can know that they are trustworthy. And in my personal opinion, even though I would say a lot of the reporters have changed since when I was there, but when I was in the media, but I do have conversations with them as part of my job. And I feel that the local media is generally has good intentions, has the best intentions for doing their job and doing it well. And so I think me having the advantage of being in PR and being from the media before, maybe I have a better understanding of how things work, and I have these personal relationships that kind of give me confidence in the media's fair reporting. I do want to point out, though, that the reporter can write the story. They can be there, interview you, write the story, but then they answer to their editor, who has the right to edit the story, and the editor answers to the publisher, who also can have a say in the story or the coverage. Not to say that they would want you to write something false, but just understand. The other thing related to that is that the headline for the story is written by the editor, not by the reporter. And I'm sure we've experienced sometimes where the headline may be different, or a little bit different from what is reported in the story, and then people get mad at the reporter, and it was just most likely a little oversight or misunderstanding on the part of the editor as far as what the article was saying. So, like, don't call up your reporter friends and blast them. If something goes wrong, just call them up nicely and just like talk to them about what was wrong or what you're upset about. That would be my advice. The other thing, I think, why people say they don't think the news media is telling the whole story, what you need to understand is that, the media has deadlines every day, and they have a certain number of stories that, or at least I did, and a lot of other media did back in the day. Maybe you guys can chime in if you still do, but you have to have a certain number of stories every day. And that's why we don't see necessarily a lot of in-depth or investigative reporting, because those things take time and people, and we need to, get our newscast out. We need to get our newspaper out. And so, that's one reason why maybe things weren't dug into deeper. And another reason is because if you have a strong frequent turnover of reporters, they don't necessarily know the backstory on what's going on. And so when I worked at the governor's office, I had a wonderful mentor. You guys may know him, Frank Rosario. He was the press secretary. And Frank was the type of person where you could read the article, but if you went to Frank, he would say, now this is the real story. And he would sit back and he would tell you what was really going on, what the history was, how it all started, who was connected to who, and he just had this really depth of understanding because of his experience in the local media and as a press secretary. And I think that's something that's really necessary and valuable in our community as far as news media being fair and telling the whole story is growing that. So in summary, I would just like to say that, let me skip to this one. Skip to the one that says it's important to critically evaluate what is said in local political news stories. 87% said yes. The question is, do we do it? Because it takes a lot of energy. If you really want to know what is the true story and who is telling the truth, and maybe everybody's telling the truth, but they're only telling part of the truth, it takes effort. So the question is, are we willing to put in the time and effort to do that? And if I could skip to the slide that says, why is it important? Why is this whole discussion important? Number one, we need to protect free speech. Free speech is a cornerstone of democracy. At the same time, we need to be responsible in our free speech, and we need to hold other people responsible. We need to hold the media responsible in ensuring that free speech is fair and accurate and thorough. Number two, a healthier news media makes a healthier community, especially in small communities like ours. It's not just the media now influencing the community, it's the community influencing the media. And that's why it's important for us as community members to voice. You know, the media would love to hear from their listeners or from their readers. And, you know, just, you know, and when you talk to them, speak respectfully. You know, you don't have to blast somebody. Just speak to them with respect. Let them know, you know, what you're interested in. How many times has the media ever been told, hey, you're doing a good job? Did anybody ever write to the editor? Well, I guess once in a while you see this, you know, good job. You know, it's a cycle between the media and the community. And last but not least, culture, connection is culture in the Marianas, and the connections between people, the connections between stories is a foundation in our community. So the connections between media and the consumer and the community is, I believe, one of our strengths here in the Marianas, and it's something that should be valued and participated in, I guess you would say. So in closing, I just want to acknowledge some of the sources I used for my thoughts today, because I'm not that smart. And I just want to say, and thank you, everybody.
All right, wonderful. Thank you for that, Catherine, for that enthusiastic presentation. I think something, I'm going to go back here a couple slides. You know, something that really resonated with me is this statement here, this little bullet point here: connection is culture in the Marianas. You know, I think something that a lot of people don't realize about reporters is what it's like during crunch time. You know what I'm saying? Like, okay, so if you didn't know, I used to be a reporter at the Guam Daily Post back when I lived in Guam for a few years. And during crunch time, from, let's call it 2 to like 4, you know, we got to get those stories in. A lot of community members don't realize that, yes, it's right. Reporters have like sometimes 4 minimum stories. Okay. And some of those stories are going to be like what, 100, 200 words. Others are going to be like 500. You might have a longer piece for a feature, right? That's coming up later in the week, you know, and like most of your morning is spent chasing the story down. And like, God bless you if you got to talk to somebody in a government office, because then they're going to be like, you can call that office. They're going to be like, oh, he's in a meeting. Oh, he stepped out. Oh, it's lunch. Call back later. Oh man, it's kind of crunch time. I got to go. Right. And it would be amazing, I think, if I just personally, this is my personal opinion. Wouldn't it be great if your reporters started like having social media pages where their personality could come out a little more? And I don't think Tomas is still here. Tomas might have left, but Tomas is excellent at this. Tomas Minagåhet is excellent about a social media presence, right? But I think these are some things that, hey, we still got some media in here. Maybe they could consider it. We have a question that was submitted a little earlier. Okay, it's 2 questions, but it's really one. I think it's going to go out to to Francis. Instagram, I'm reading it verbatim. Instagram has a fact-checking feature where large, reputable institutions contribute further details on what is and isn't true in a news-related Instagram post. The CNMI is a small place, and I can imagine that these fact-checking institutions don't have the CNMI on its radar yet. What is currently done to combat misinformation in CNMI news, especially CNMI news posted on social media? And then this person continued, may I add to my question, is misinformation on CNMI news spread on social media a potential, ongoing, or minimal issue right now? I'm going to guess it's going to Francis, but Catherine, feel free, chime in as well.
Okay, as I told Andrew, I think like a few weeks ago, it's like this is where I fall short because I'm not from the CNMI. I'm from Guam, and at least in the Guam context, I mean, there's talk about them trying to do stuff, but the thing is, our island used to have man, my head is like not working right now. The AP, what's it called? Like an ethics board thing, like
Society of Professional
there you
Journalists.
go. Yeah, SPJ. So we used to have an SPJ organization, but I think when I was still in college and going to school at UOG, we had one at that point. But I heard when I left, that year I left is when they started dissolved, and I think that was either 2001 or 2, around that era. And so we no longer have that. So it's something like an SPJ that should be spearheading that and maybe trying to get the legislature involved. And so as far as Guam is concerned, we don't have something like that. The problem is that I'm not sure if you guys are aware of Section 230. It's like it's a federal code, and it's basically what if you've heard about that, it makes these social platforms like Facebook, Instagram, they're off the hook. They're not accountable basically for what's posted up on their sites. I mean, it could be fake stuff, and it's really up to people like Mark Zuckerberg, who does a lot of the decision making in his companies like Instagram and Facebook as to whether or not they're going to do something about that. And until the federal government cracks down on that and maybe passes and changes up that code, nothing is going to happen about it. But I don't know again, I'm sorry, I'm not from the CNMI, so maybe Catherine would know more about that.
It takes effort. It takes effort to really get to the bottom of things sometimes, because there's different opinions. So, and everybody's accountable for themselves. Like if you want to believe something right off the bat without verifying it or putting any critical thought into it, then that's you. But if you want to be more self-aware and aware of what the truth is, it will take some effort on your part.
All right, thank you guys for that. I personally wrote a question down for Francis as he was giving his presentation. Francis, knowing that people are less media literate than they perceive themselves to be, what are the implications for local newsrooms?
So I mean, maybe the answer to that would be probably given up in the next. It's the last webinar, which we talk about like journalistic functions and so forth. And I from a newsroom's perspective, I guess they, as Catherine was alluding to, they're like fact checking and all that stuff, and that's really important. At least in the Guam context, anecdotally, like I see GuamPDN.com is one that is probably that I trust a lot. I'm no offense to anyone here, but Daily Post does also a good job. I did run a survey correspondingly along with, at the same time that I ran the survey, or we ran the survey in the CNMI, I did one in Guam, which has similar measures, but obviously different news media, right? And at least in the Guam context, people do see those legacy media, the newspapers are the most trusted. And if they are the ones that are most trusted, and from a media literacy standpoint, is whatever they're doing, that's what the other media should be doing as well. And that's probably what all I could add to that. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
Catherine, would you like to address it, or shall we move on?
You can move on, I think.
Okay. This is just also, again, for Francis, something I want to clarify. It's not essentially a question. There were a few data points about use and its correlation to skepticism. So just to clarify, the more you use a newspaper or a news source, the more you are skeptical of the source itself, or is that just media in general?
Oh, wait, sorry. I was muted there. So that variable is news media skepticism, which is not the source itself. So that's basically it's what you call a trait, I guess. Like, it's not targeted to a specific source. And so the closest thing that we got with skepticism was trust of the source. And I don't think, if I recall, the trust was not related with news media skepticism. I'm just looking at my results here. And then, but social media platforms, trust of social media platforms was negatively associated with self-perceived news media literacy. But going back to answer your question, that's a specific construct of one's news media skepticism, but not specific skepticism toward an actual source. So, but the proxy for that would be trust.
Okay, all right. I'm going to make a shout out to our attendees. I'm gonna do a last call for questions. If anybody would like to type it into the chat or send it in to the Q&A portion, would anyone like to do that? Any questions for clarification from our attendees? Okay, if not, you can always email me, the Humanities Council, okay? Or Francis shared his email as well, okay? And if that is all, I am willing to close this webinar today, all right? I wanna thank you to Francis. I wanna say thank you to Francis and Catherine for their time, their effort, and their presentation for today. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you too.
All right, see everybody next week for the third installment of the Minagåhet Ellet webinar series. Thank you very much.
Lela.
Thank you.